The USA-NATO War by Erwin Montrose, Chapter 1, The Unexpected Decree. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the White House south lawn. Inside the Oval Office, the atmosphere was electric, charged with an anticipation that felt almost tangible. President Donald Trump sat behind the resolute desk, his expression unusually somber. The light from the grand chandelier above glinted off the polished surface of the desk, illuminating the gathered faces of his closest advisors. Each advisor carried a different expression. Some wore masks of stoic professionalism, others barely concealed their apprehension. In the corner, General Robert Harding, a seasoned military strategist with decades of experience, shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressed into a thin line. Beside him stood White House Chief of Staff Janice Porter, her arms crossed tightly, her knuckles white. Trump's gaze swept across the room. He relished the silence, the tension. It was his stage, and he intended to dominate it. At last, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but laced with an urgency that turned heads. "The time has come for us to take decisive action. For the future of our great nation, I am announcing tonight our intention to reclaim Greenland as part of the United States." The room erupted. Advisors exchanged stunned glances, while murmurs and gasps filled the air. Janice Porter's voice broke through the cacophony. "Mr. President," she said, stepping forward, "Greenland? By what means?" "By any means necessary," Trump interrupted, his tone sharper now, his gaze unwavering. "It's a strategic move. We need it for our future. Resources, positioning, it's non-negotiable." The gravity of the declaration hung in the room like an unspoken accusation. General Harding finally spoke. "Mr. President, such an action would provoke NATO. They'll invoke Article 5 immediately. It could mean war with our allies." Trump dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "Our allies need to learn who's really in charge. The U.S. carries NATO. Without us, they're nothing. They'll fall in line when they see we mean business." Outside the walls of the White House, the announcement was met with bewilderment and disbelief. Within minutes, news networks interrupted their programming, their anchors struggling to process the implications of Trump's words. Headlines blared across the bottom of screens. "Breaking news: U.S. President claims Greenland for America." In living rooms across the nation, families gathered in disbelief. In Boston, an elderly woman shook her head at the television. "Greenland? He's lost his mind," she muttered to her equally incredulous husband. In Austin, Texas, a group of college students erupted into heated debate. On social media, hashtags like Greenland Crisis and Trump War trended within hours. Across the Atlantic, world leaders scrambled. In the quiet halls of Brussels, NATO representatives convened an emergency meeting. Prime ministers, presidents, and foreign ministers dialed in to secure video calls, their faces etched with concern. French President Élodie Marchand voiced the collective anxiety. "We cannot allow this to escalate into an armed conflict. But how do we respond without triggering something worse?" Meanwhile, in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, the news sent ripples of fear and confusion through the community. The people of Greenland, largely independent but under Danish sovereignty, found themselves thrust into the global spotlight. Danish Prime Minister Henrik Jørgensen delivered a defiant statement. "Greenland is not for sale, nor will it be taken by force. Denmark will defend its territory and its people." In Washington, protests erupted almost overnight. Crowds gathered outside the White House, chanting slogans and waving signs. "Not in our name," shouted a young woman, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Nearby, a man in his 40s held up a placard that read, "No blood for ICE." Inside the Oval Office, Trump remained undeterred. He stood before the grand windows, staring out at the darkened lawn. In the reflection of the glass, his expression was unreadable, his thoughts a mystery. Turning to General Harding, he spoke in a low voice. "Prepare the orders. We're moving forward." Harding hesitated, but the weight of his oath was heavier than his conscience. With a reluctant nod, he left the room to set the wheels of history in motion. Outside, the world held its breath. Chapter 2: A Divided Nation. The announcement reverberated through the United States like an earthquake, shaking the foundations of its already polarized society. By morning, the streets of Washington, D.C. were flooded with protesters. Placards bearing messages like "No War for Greenland" and "Diplomacy" not tyranny, waved against the backdrop of the Capitol building. The chants of thousands echoed across the National Mall, a cacophony of dissent that painted a vivid picture of a nation in turmoil. The division wasn't confined to the streets. In households across America, families were torn apart by arguments. At a modest dining table in Cleveland, Ohio, a father and son sat in a heated exchange. "This is about America's future," the father insisted, his knuckles gripping the edge of the table. "Greenland has resources we need. We can't let China or Russia get there first." The son shook his head, his face flushed with anger. "At what cost? We're risking war with NATO. Do you even hear yourself?" In New York City, the mood was similarly charged. Protesters clashed with counter-protesters in Times Square. A man in a red "Make America Great Again" hat shouted over the crowd, "Trump's making history. You all just can't handle a strong leader." His words were met with boos and jeers as police stepped in to separate the factions. Within the corridors of power, the conflict was even more palpable. In a dimly lit conference room in the Pentagon, military leaders convened to discuss the president's orders. General Robert Harding presided over the meeting, his face a mask of frustration. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harding began, his voice firm, "we're being asked to prepare for an unprecedented conflict. We're not just talking about Greenland. If NATO invokes Article 5, we'll be facing our own allies." A younger officer spoke up, his voice quivering. "With all due respect, sir, this doesn't sit right. Fighting NATO, it feels wrong." Harding nodded. "It doesn't just feel wrong, it is wrong. But our job is to execute, not question." In the White House, the rift was equally evident. Chief of Staff Janice Porter found herself in a precarious position, balancing her loyalty to the administration with her growing concerns. In a private meeting with Vice President Malcolm Green, she voiced her doubts. "This isn't sustainable," she said, pacing the room. "The protests are escalating. The military is divided. If we push forward, we risk tearing the country apart." Green leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't disagree," he said slowly. "But what's the alternative? Resign? Go public with our concerns? Either way, we're out, and Trump still has the wheel." The media, too, played its part in fueling the divide. Cable news networks became battlegrounds of their own, with anchors and pundits dissecting the situation from every angle. On one network, a commentator praised Trump's decisiveness, calling it a bold move to secure America's future. On another, a journalist slammed the decision as reckless brinkmanship. Social media fanned the flames. Viral hashtags like Greenland Gate and Stop the Madness trended across platforms. Memes flooded timelines, mocking everything from Trump's geography skills to the absurdity of claiming Greenland. But beneath the humor lay a palpable sense of fear and uncertainty. For those in the military, the tension was especially acute. At Fort Bragg, Private First Class Amanda Hayes sat on her bunk, staring at her phone. The protests, the debates, it was all too much. Beside her, Sergeant Mike Reynolds tried to offer some reassurance. "Don't overthink it, Hayes," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Orders are orders. We do our job." Hayes looked up, her eyes filled with doubt. "But what if our job is wrong?" Reynolds hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we do it anyway. That's what we signed up for." As the days passed, the nation's fractures deepened. The protests grew larger and more organized, drawing support from celebrities, activists, and even some politicians. In Los Angeles, a massive rally was headlined by a popular actor who delivered a fiery speech condemning the administration's actions. "This is not the America we want to be," he declared to thunderous applause. In Washington, Trump watched the unrest unfold on television. His jaw tightened as he switched between channels, each one filled with images of dissent. "Fake news," he muttered under his breath. Turning to his press secretary, he said, "We need to control the narrative. Get me on primetime TV." That night, Trump addressed the nation from the Oval Office. Framed by American flags, he spoke directly to the camera, his tone calm but resolute. "My fellow Americans," he began, "we are at a crossroads. The future of our nation's security and prosperity depends on bold action. Greenland is not just a piece of land. It is a key to our survival in a competitive world." For some, his words were persuasive, a rallying cry for patriotism and strength. For others, they were the hollow rhetoric of a leader out of touch with reality. The speech did little to bridge the divide. If anything, it deepened it. By the end of the week, America stood on the edge of chaos. Protests had spread to nearly every major city. The military faced growing dissent within its ranks, and in the White House the seeds of rebellion began to take root. Chapter 3. The gathering storm across the Atlantic, the shockwaves from Trump's announcement reverberated through the halls of NATO headquarters in Brussels. The North Atlantic Council, NATO's governing body, convened in an emergency session. Ambassadors and defense ministers from the 31 member nations sat around a vast, circular table, their faces grim. The room was filled with low murmurs and the occasional raised voice. French President Élodie Marchand joined via secure video link, her image projected onto a large screen at the head of the room. Her tone was resolute as she addressed the council. "This is not a question of resources or territorial disputes," Marchand said, her sharp gaze scanning the room. "This is about the integrity of NATO. If we do not respond decisively to this aggression, we risk undermining the very foundation of our alliance." British Prime Minister Callum Hargrove nodded in agreement. "We must invoke Article 5, he said, his voice firm. "An attack on Greenland is an attack on us all. The question is not if we respond, but how." The Danish ambassador, Ingrid Sørensen, clenched her fists tightly as she spoke. "Greenland is not just a strategic territory. It is home to our people. We cannot allow this invasion to proceed unchecked." Yet not everyone in the room shared their confidence. The Italian ambassador leaned forward, his voice tinged with caution. "We must consider the consequences of escalation. The United States is our most powerful ally. Are we truly prepared to face them in open conflict?" A tense silence fell over the room. It was the unspoken fear that no one wanted to voice aloud. War with the United States, a superpower with unmatched military might. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, NATO's top military strategists worked tirelessly to prepare for the possibility of war. In a secure briefing room, General Hans Koenig of Germany stood before a large digital map, pointing out potential strategies. "The U.S. will deploy its naval forces to assert dominance in the North Atlantic," Koenig explained. "Our priority must be to establish a defensive perimeter around Greenland. A blockade is essential." Admiral Sofia Petrov of Norway raised an eyebrow. "And if they break the blockade?" Koenig's jaw tightened. "Then we face them head-on, but we must tread carefully. Every skirmish carries the risk of escalation." As the strategists debated, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. NATO forces began mobilizing across Europe. Troops were deployed, fighter jets scrambled, and naval fleets repositioned. In Iceland, a critical staging ground, soldiers prepared for the worst. The air buzzed with the hum of aircraft engines and the barked orders of commanding officers. Amidst the preparations, a spirit of unity emerged within the alliance. Nations set aside their differences, focusing on the collective goal of defending Greenland and preserving the alliance. Old rivalries were forgotten, replaced by a shared determination to stand firm against aggression. Across the globe, other powers watched the unfolding drama with keen interest. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin convened his inner circle in the Kremlin. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with cigar smoke. Putin leaned back in his chair, a sly smile playing on his lips. "This is an opportunity," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "While NATO is distracted, we can advance our own interests. The Baltics, Ukraine, they are vulnerable. Let the Americans and Europeans tear each other apart. We will pick up the pieces." In Beijing, President Xi Jinping studied a detailed map of the South China Sea. His advisors flanked him, offering updates on military exercises and diplomatic overtures. "With the West divided, we must solidify our position," Xi declared. "Taiwan, the Pacific Islands, this is our moment to expand our influence, but we must act with precision. Let them exhaust themselves first." In Pyongyang, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un watched footage of Trump's announcement with amusement. "The great American empire is crumbling," he remarked to his generals. "Let us show the world our strength." Back in the United States, the divide deepened. In Washington, protests outside the White House swelled in size. The once peaceful demonstrations turned violent as clashes broke out between protesters and counter-protesters. Riot police lined the streets, their shields and batons at the ready. Inside the Oval Office, Trump remained resolute. Flanked by his closest advisors, he reviewed plans for the deployment of naval forces. General Harding presented the strategy with a heavy heart. "We'll deploy the Atlantic Fleet to establish dominance around Greenland," Harding explained. "It's a calculated risk, Mr. President. NATO will respond, but we believe we can maintain an advantage." Trump nodded, his expression steely. "Good, make it happen." As the first U.S. ships set sail for the North Atlantic, the world teetered on the brink of war. Tensions rose with each passing hour, the possibility of diplomacy fading into the background. In Greenland, the people braced themselves for what was to come. In the quiet town of Nuuk, a schoolteacher named Arnie stood before his class, struggling to maintain a sense of normalcy. The children, sensing the fear in their parents, asked questions he could not answer. "Why does America want Greenland?" one boy asked, his voice small and uncertain. Arnie hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, nations make decisions based on what they think is best for their future, but it doesn't always mean it's the right decision." Outside, the skies grew darker, as if mirroring the storm that was about to unfold. Chapter 4: Allies and Enemies. As the storm clouds of conflict gathered over the North Atlantic, the world's most powerful nations scrambled to align their strategies, exploit opportunities, and fortify their positions in the shadow of an impending war. The global chessboard was shifting, and every move was fraught with risk. In the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin stood at the head of a long conference table, his generals and advisors seated around him. A large map of Eastern Europe dominated the room, dotted with red and blue markers representing Russian and NATO forces. The atmosphere was tense yet calculated, the flicker of opportunity glinting in Putin's steely gaze. "This is our moment," Putin said, his voice calm but commanding. "The Americans are distracted, their forces stretched. NATO will be too preoccupied with Greenland to focus on our actions. We can reclaim territories that rightfully belong under Russian influence." One of his generals, a grizzled veteran of the Georgian conflict, leaned forward. "Do we risk overextending, Mr. President? The Baltic states are heavily fortified, and NATO still has significant resources in Eastern Europe." Putin waved a dismissive hand. "We move with precision. Deploy our little green men in strategic locations. No insignias, no direct acknowledgement of their origin. We destabilize from within. By the time NATO reacts, it will be too late." As the generals nodded in agreement, covert plans began to take shape. Russian forces quietly mobilized along the borders of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Cyber attacks disrupted communications and infrastructure in the Baltic states, sowing confusion and fear. Propaganda campaigns flooded social media, painting Russia as a liberator and NATO as an aggressor. In Beijing, a similar meeting was underway in the Zhongnanhai leadership compound. President Xi Jinping listened intently as his advisors outlined the opportunities arising from the West's internal divisions. "The South China Sea is ours to dominate," one advisor argued. "With the Americans occupied in Greenland, their Pacific Fleet will be vulnerable. We should advance our territorial claims and solidify our influence over Taiwan." Xi nodded thoughtfully. "But we must tread carefully. A misstep could unite the West against us. Focus on economic and diplomatic measures first. Strengthen our alliances in the region and offer support to nations wary of American unpredictability. Let them see China as the stable power." Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un reveled in the chaos. North Korea's missile tests increased in frequency, each launch a thinly veiled message to the world. State media declared the tests were a demonstration of unstoppable strength in the face of global instability. Behind closed doors, Kim's generals proposed leveraging the distraction to demand concessions from the U.S. and South Korea. "We will rattle the cage," Kim declared with a grin, "but we will not provoke a direct conflict, yet." As these powers maneuvered in the shadows, smaller nations found themselves caught in the crossfire. In Eastern Europe, refugees began to flee from border regions, fearing a resurgence of Russian aggression. The roads leading to Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary were clogged with vehicles, the occupants carrying whatever they could salvage. In Nuuk, Greenland's capital, the tension was palpable. Danish and Greenlandic leaders held emergency meetings, coordinating with NATO while preparing for the worst. Prime Minister Henrik Jørgensen arrived in Nuuk to offer his support, but his words did little to calm the growing unease among the population. "Greenland is not just a territory," Jørgensen declared at a press conference. It is home to a proud and resilient people. We will stand with NATO to defend our sovereignty. In the United States, the cracks in the administration grew wider. Chief of Staff Janice Porter, increasingly disillusioned, met secretly with Vice President Malcolm Green in a quiet corner of the West Wing. "We can't keep pretending this is sustainable," Porter said, her voice low but urgent. "Trump's decision has alienated half the government, and the military is on the brink of revolt. If we don't act now, this will spiral out of control." Green frowned, his fingers drumming on the table. "And what do you suggest? A coup? Resignation? Either way, the fallout will be catastrophic." As the internal strife deepened, Trump doubled down on his rhetoric. During a rally in Florida, he addressed a roaring crowd of supporters, painting his actions as a necessary stand against global bullies. "They want us to back down," Trump declared, his voice booming. "They want America to play second fiddle to NATO, to China, to Russia. But we won't. We're bringing Greenland into the fold, and we're doing it for you, the American people." The crowd erupted in cheers, but the rest of the country watched with unease. Protests grew more intense, with clashes between demonstrators and police turning violent. In New York City, tear gas filled the streets as officers tried to disperse a massive rally outside Trump Tower. Back in Brussels, NATO's leadership finalized their strategy. Secretary General Lars Usberg stood before a gathering of military commanders, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," Usberg began, "the time for deliberation has passed. The United States has crossed a line that cannot be ignored. We must invoke Article 5 and defend Greenland with all necessary force." The room erupted in applause, a rare show of unity in the face of crisis. Plans were put into motion, and NATO forces began their deployment to the North Atlantic. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines converged on the icy waters around Greenland, their crews bracing for the inevitable confrontation. As the pieces moved into place, the world stood on the brink of a conflict unlike any it had seen before. Alliances were tested, enemies emboldened, and the fragile balance of power teetered on the edge of collapse. Chapter 5: The First Engagement. The icy waters of the North Atlantic became the stage for the first confrontation as the United States and NATO prepared to test each other's resolve. The blockade surrounding Greenland was a masterpiece of strategic planning, tight enough to deter, yet flexible enough to avoid accidental escalation. NATO's naval forces patrolled in synchronized precision, their warships bristling with weapons and their crews on constant alert. On board the HMS Defiant, a British destroyer assigned to the blockade, Captain Sarah Morrow scanned the horizon with a pair of binoculars. The cold wind bit at her face, but her focus never wavered. The faint outline of an approaching fleet shimmered on the radar screen, confirmed moments later by a young officer's voice. "Captain, multiple contacts inbound," the officer reported, his tone a mix of professionalism and unease. "American warships, approximately 50 nautical miles away." Morrow set down the binoculars and turned to her bridge crew. "Alert the fleet. Maintain position, but prepare for evasive maneuvers. We hold the line, no matter what." Aboard the USS Freedom, an American aircraft carrier leading the U.S. fleet, Admiral Jonathan Reed stood on the command deck, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice was steady as he addressed his officers. "NATO thinks they can block us out, but we'll show them the strength of the United States Navy. Maintain formation and proceed to the blockade. We're here to make a statement." As the two fleets drew closer, the tension was palpable. Sonar pings echoed through the water, each side carefully tracking the other's movements. Fighter jets roared overhead, their sleek forms cutting through the gray skies like arrows. The first engagement came suddenly and without warning. A NATO frigate, the French Jeanne d'Arc, detected a small, unidentified vessel attempting to breach the blockade. Suspecting it to be an American reconnaissance drone disguised as a civilian ship, the frigate's commander ordered a warning shot. The shell exploded harmlessly in the water, but the message was clear. On the USS Freedom, Admiral Reed clenched his jaw as reports came in. "They fired on one of our drones," a communications officer relayed. "No damage, but they're testing us." Reed nodded grimly. "Send a clear response. Deploy a squadron of jets to buzz their positions, but no weapons fire unless provoked." Moments later, a swarm of F-35s screamed toward the blockade. their presence a calculated show of force. On the HMS Defiant, Captain Morrow watched the jets approach with narrowed eyes. "Hold steady," she ordered, her voice cutting through the tension on the bridge. "They're trying to intimidate us, but we won't be the first to escalate." The jets flew low and fast, passing just above the NATO ships before peeling away. The maneuver rattled crew members, but the blockade held firm. Yet the incident ignited a firestorm of activity in command centers across the world. In Washington, President Trump was briefed on the situation in the Situation Room. His advisors presented a spectrum of responses, ranging from cautious diplomacy to aggressive military action. Trump waved off the cautious approach. "They want to play games? Fine. Let's show them we're serious. Deploy additional forces and let them know we're not backing down." Across the Atlantic, NATO Secretary General Lars Östberg received similar briefings. His advisors warned of the growing risk of escalation, but Östberg remained resolute. "We knew this would happen," he said. "Reinforce the blockade and prepare for potential skirmishes. We must not yield." As both sides dug in, the North Atlantic became a theater of tension and uncertainty. The icy waters churned with the movements of submarines, their silent hunters prowling beneath the waves. NATO's submarines, equipped with advanced stealth technology, shadowed the American fleet, their sonar operators listening intently for any sign of hostile action. The first true skirmish erupted under the cover of night. A U.S. destroyer, the USS Valor, detected a NATO submarine attempting to track its movements. Believing it to be an act of aggression, the destroyer launched a series of depth charges. The explosions lit up the dark waters, sending shock waves through the surrounding area. The NATO submarine, a German vessel named U-47, narrowly avoided destruction. Its captain, Commander Klaus Hartmann, ordered an emergency ascent, surfacing just beyond the range of the destroyer's weapons. The confrontation ended without casualties, but the message was clear. The fragile balance was crumbling. News of the skirmish spread quickly, fueling fears of a full-scale war. In Greenland, the residents of Nuuk watched the unfolding events with a mix of dread and resignation. Local leader Arne Olsen addressed a crowd in the town square, his voice carrying over the cold wind. "We are caught in the middle of a conflict we did not ask for," he said, "but we will endure. Our ancestors survived the harshest conditions, and so will we." Back in Washington, the mood grew increasingly tense. Protesters outside the White House clashed with police, their chants of "No War for Greenland" drowned out by sirens and the crackle of tear gas canisters. Inside, Trump doubled down on his rhetoric, framing the conflict as a test of American resolve. "They think we'll fold," he told his advisors. "They think we'll cave under pressure. But they're wrong. We'll push forward, and they'll have no choice but to back down." In Brussels, NATO leaders echoed a similar determination. "We cannot afford to blink," Östberg said during a meeting of the North Atlantic Council. To falter now would be to invite further aggression. As dawn broke over the North Atlantic, the two fleets remained locked in a tense standoff. The first engagement had passed, but the world knew it was only a matter of time before the next spark ignited the powder keg. Chapter 6: The New Iron Curtain. While the North Atlantic became the epicenter of the conflict, a quieter but equally consequential drama unfolded in Eastern Europe and the Pacific. Russia and China seized the opportunity created by the US-NATO standoff, each pursuing their own strategic ambitions. The emergence of a new global order began to take shape, a modern Iron Curtain spreading not just across Europe but around the world. Moscow's advance in Moscow. President Vladimir Putin stood before a massive digital map of Eastern Europe, his generals and advisors at his side. Red markers indicated Russian troop movements across the borders of Belarus and Ukraine, while intelligence reports highlighted NATO's focus on Greenland. "We move now," Putin declared. "The Americans are distracted, and NATO cannot fight on two fronts." The Kremlin's rhetoric was thinly veiled as stabilization efforts to protect ethnic Russians in the region. But the reality was clear. This was a calculated bid to reclaim territories lost in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russian forces moved swiftly and decisively, deploying unmarked soldiers, infamously known as Little Green Men, to destabilize key regions. In Kyiv, the Ukrainian government scrambled to respond. President Olesya Horodetska addressed her nation in a televised speech, her face a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. Russia has once again shown its true colors, she said. But Ukraine will not bow. We have fought for our independence before, and we will fight again. On the ground, Russian tanks rolled into contested areas in eastern Ukraine, meeting resistance from Ukrainian forces. The city of Kharkiv became a flashpoint, its streets echoing with the sounds of gunfire and shelling. Civilians fled in droves, creating a refugee crisis that spilled over into neighboring countries like Poland and Romania. Beijing's maneuver. Meanwhile, in Beijing, President Xi Jinping held court with his top military and diplomatic advisors. A map of the Pacific dominated the conference room, dotted with islands marked in red. While the West is preoccupied, we must solidify our control in the South China Sea, Xi said. Taiwan remains our ultimate goal, but we must move incrementally to avoid direct confrontation. Chinese naval forces began an aggressive expansion, constructing artificial islands equipped with military bases and airstrips. In the Pacific, smaller nations found themselves caught in Beijing's web of economic influence. Through loans and infrastructure deals, China tightened its grip, offering support to countries willing to distance themselves from the United States. In Taipei, the Taiwanese government watched these developments with growing alarm. President Lin Meihua convened an emergency session of her cabinet, urging her people to prepare for the worst. "We face a critical moment in our history," she said, "but Taiwan will not be intimidated. We stand ready to defend our sovereignty." The global fracture. Across the world, nations began to realign themselves in response to the growing chaos. In the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia, longtime adversaries, found themselves reevaluating their priorities. The instability in the West offered a rare opportunity for influence, but also the risk of unintended consequences. Covert talks between rival powers hinted at temporary truces, as both sought to navigate the shifting landscape. In Africa and South America, smaller nations grappled with the fallout. Economies tied to Western trade faltered as markets plummeted. In Johannesburg, a journalist for a local paper summed up the sentiment. Once again, the global South bears the brunt of conflicts it did not create. The new curtain falls. In Eastern Europe, the advance of Russian forces prompted NATO to hastily reinforce its eastern flank. In Warsaw, Polish citizens lined up to enlist, their determination a testament to the region's long history of resisting aggression. "We will not be the next Crimea," a young recruit declared, his voice resolute. Despite their efforts, cracks in NATO's unity began to show. Hungary's government, already accused of cozying up to Moscow, hesitated to fully commit to the alliance's response. This hesitation sent shockwaves through Brussels, where NATO Secretary General Lars Ostberg struggled to maintain cohesion. "The stakes have never been higher," Ostberg warned in a public address. "This is not just about Greenland or Eastern Europe. This is about the principles that bind us as allies." In Washington, the White House faced its own turmoil. President Trump, emboldened by his core supporters, continued to dismiss concerns about Russia's actions. In a press conference, he deflected criticism. "Russia's doing what's best for Russia," he said with a shrug. "I'm focused on what's best for America. Greenland is the priority." His comments drew sharp rebukes from both sides of the aisle. Senator Evelyn Carter, a prominent Democrat, called it the most dangerous abdication of leadership in modern history. Even some Republicans began to distance themselves, wary of the political fallout. Life behind the curtain. For those caught behind the new Iron Curtain, life became a delicate balance of survival and defiance. In Latvia, local resistance groups formed in secret, their members determined to fight against Russian occupation. They shared encrypted messages and smuggled supplies, their actions reminiscent of the Cold War era. In Greenland, the looming presence of American and NATO forces disrupted daily life. Fishermen found their waters patrolled by warships, while supply chains faltered under the strain of conflict. In Nuuk, local leader Arne Olsen spoke to a gathering of townspeople. "We must remember who we are," he said. "No matter what happens, we are Greenlanders first, and we will endure, a world divided." As the first battles unfolded in the North Atlantic and beyond, the world began to take on a new shape. The alliances that had defined the post-World War II era were fracturing, replaced by an unpredictable and dangerous new order. The curtain had fallen, dividing nations and ideologies with an iron resolve. Yet, amidst the chaos, whispers of resistance emerged. In underground networks, hackers and activists worked tirelessly to expose disinformation and connect divided populations. A movement began to grow, a fragile hope that even in the darkest times, unity and truth might prevail. Chapter 7: Fractures. Back in the United States, the Greenland conflict began to take a heavy toll, not just on its global standing, but on the fragile fabric of the nation itself. The pressure of the crisis seeped into every corner of society, exposing deep divisions within the government, military, and public. The cracks in leadership. Inside the White House, the atmosphere grew more strained with each passing day. President Trump's inner circle, once a tightly knit group of loyalists, began to fracture. Chief of Staff Janice Porter, increasingly uneasy with the president's decisions, found herself at odds with the administration's hawkish advisors. In a dimly lit office late one evening, Porter met with Vice President Malcolm Green. The two spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely rising above a whisper. "This can't continue," Porter said, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "The protests, the unrest, the military pushback, it's all spiraling out of control." Green nodded, his face lined with worry. "But what can we do? If we publicly oppose him, it'll spark a constitutional crisis. If we stay silent, we're complicit." Porter's voice dropped even lower. "There's talk of invoking the 25th Amendment. Some members of the cabinet are considering it." Green's eyes widened. "That's a dangerous road, Janice. It could tear the country apart." "It already is," she replied. Elsewhere in Washington, whispers of dissent grew louder. In private meetings, congressional leaders debated the possibility of impeachment. Senator Evelyn Carter, a vocal critic of the administration, convened a bipartisan group of lawmakers in her Capitol Hill office. "This is no longer about politics," Carter said, her voice firm. "This is about the survival of our democracy. We cannot allow one man's hubris to drag us into a war we don't want and can't afford." The group nodded in agreement, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. Any attempt to remove Trump from office would face fierce resistance from his supporters, both in Congress and among the public. The military's crisis of conscience. The U.S. military, traditionally apolitical, found itself caught in an unprecedented moral and constitutional dilemma. At the Pentagon, General Robert Harding convened a meeting of senior officers to discuss the growing unease within the ranks. "Morale is plummeting," Harding said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've received reports of soldiers questioning their orders. Some are even talking about refusing to deploy." Admiral Karen Lynn, a decorated Navy officer, leaned forward. "We swore an oath to defend the Constitution, not to follow unconstitutional orders. If this escalates, we could face mutiny." Harding sighed. "We walk a fine line. Publicly opposing the president could destabilize the entire chain of command. But privately, I fear we're losing control." The tensions within the military were mirrored on the ground. At Fort Bragg, Private First Class Amanda Hayes struggled with her own doubts. She sat in the barracks, scrolling through social media posts about the protests. Nearby, her squad leader, Sergeant Mike Reynolds, noticed her distracted demeanor. "Hayes," Reynolds said, sitting down beside her, "you've been quiet lately. Something on your mind?" Hayes hesitated, then looked up. "I'm not sure I can do this, Sergeant. Fighting NATO, it feels wrong. They're supposed to be our allies." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I get it. This isn't what any of us signed up for. But orders are orders." Hayes frowned. "What if the orders are wrong?" Reynolds didn't have an answer. The streets in turmoil. As the internal strife deepened, the streets of America became battlegrounds of their own. Protests against the Greenland conflict grew larger and more violent. In Portland, Oregon, a demonstration turned into a full-blown riot as protesters clashed with police. Tear gas filled the air, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the downtown streets. In Washington, D.C., the National Guard was deployed to maintain order, but their presence only heightened tensions. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a young activist named Rachel Martinez addressed a crowd of thousands. "We are not the enemy," she shouted into a megaphone. "The real enemy is the arrogance and greed of those who put their ambitions above the lives of ordinary people. This is our country, and we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. "No war. No war. Factions in the shadows. Amid the chaos, far-right militias and conspiracy theorists seized the opportunity to stoke division. Armed groups began to organize, framing the protests as a threat to national security. In rural Montana, a militia leader named Jack Keller recorded a video message that quickly went viral. "This is the time for patriots to stand up," Keller declared, his rifle prominently displayed. "The government is weak, and the protesters are traitors. It's up to us to defend our freedoms." The video sent shockwaves through law enforcement and intelligence agencies, who scrambled to track and contain the growing threat of domestic extremism. The president's isolation. Inside the White House, President Trump grew increasingly isolated. The once bustling West Wing now felt like a ghost town, with staff members avoiding the president for fear of becoming targets of his ire. Late at night, Trump paced the Oval Office, his frustration boiling over. "They're all cowards," he muttered to himself. "Nobody has the guts to stand with me." His closest advisor, Stephen McCall, tried to reassure him. "Mr. President, your base is still with you. The rallies are proof of that." Trump waved him off. "Rallies won't win a war, McCall. I need results. Get Harding back in here. I want to know why this Greenland operation isn't moving faster." But even McCall could see the cracks forming in the foundation of the administration. A nation on the brink. As the fractures widened, the question loomed: how much longer could the United States hold itself together? The Greenland conflict had exposed the deep divisions within the nation, threatening to unravel the fragile threads that bound it. In living rooms, classrooms, and military bases, Americans grappled with the uncertainty of their future. The country stood on the edge of chaos, teetering between rebellion and resilience, between collapse and unity. Chapter 8. The Human Cost. As the Greenland conflict escalated, the war's shadow loomed large over the lives of ordinary people around the globe. For soldiers, civilians, and families alike, the human cost of the unfolding crisis became increasingly difficult to ignore. The abstract debates of strategy and policy transformed into visceral realities, with consequences felt in homes, battlefields, and refugee camps. Families torn apart. In a quiet suburb of Des Moines, Iowa, Emma Randall sat at her kitchen table, staring at a letter from her son, Private Tyler Randall. The young soldier had been deployed with his unit to the North Atlantic as part of the American fleet's buildup. His letter was filled with reassurances that felt hollow to Emma, who couldn't shake the fear that gripped her heart. "Mom, it's cold out here, but we're ready. Don't worry about me. I'll be home before you know it." Emma folded the letter carefully, tears welling in her eyes. Across the country, families like hers struggled with the same uncertainty. The conflict had taken their loved ones far from home, and the possibility of losing them weighed heavily on their minds. In Greenland, the anxiety was no less acute. In the capital city of Nuuk, Arnie Olsen sat with his wife and two young children at their modest dinner table. The distant rumble of military aircraft overhead served as a constant reminder of the tensions surrounding them. "Will the war come here, Papa?" Arnie's youngest daughter, Sana, asked, her wide eyes filled with worry. Arnie exchanged a glance with his wife before forcing a smile. "No, little one," he said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "We'll be safe." But the people of Greenland were acutely aware of their precarious position. The buildup of NATO and U.S. forces in the surrounding waters had disrupted daily life. Fishermen reported encounters with military vessels, their nets damaged by submarines patrolling beneath the surface. Supplies became harder to procure as shipping routes were redirected or blocked. Economic collapse and displacement. The economic fallout from the conflict rippled across the globe. Stock markets in Europe, the U.S., and Asia experienced wild fluctuations, plunging millions into financial uncertainty. In London, a young couple, James and Clara Turner, stared at the notice from their landlord announcing a rent increase. "This is because of the war, isn't it?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Everything's getting more expensive." James nodded grimly. "Gas prices, groceries, everything. It's all connected." In Eastern Europe, the refugee crisis deepened as Russian advances in Ukraine forced thousands to flee. Makeshift camps sprang up along the Polish and Romanian borders, where aid workers struggled to provide food, shelter, and medical care to the influx of displaced families. Marta Kowalski, a Polish volunteer, worked tirelessly in one such camp. She handed out blankets to a group of refugees huddled together against the biting cold. "Where will we go?" one woman asked, clutching her infant son tightly. Marta offered a reassuring smile. "For now, you'll stay here. We're working to find homes for everyone." But the strain on local resources was immense. Governments and humanitarian organizations faced mounting challenges as the number of refugees continued to grow. The streets of division. Back in the United States, the protests against the Greenland conflict reached a fever pitch. In Chicago, a massive rally filled Grant Park, where speakers addressed a crowd of tens of thousands. Among them was Rachel Martinez, the young activist who had become a leading voice for the anti-war movement. "This is not just about Greenland," Rachel shouted into the microphone. "This is about the soul of our nation. We cannot let fear and greed dictate our future." The crowd erupted in cheers, but not everyone was in agreement. Across the street, a smaller group of pro-war demonstrators waved American flags and signs reading "Support our troops" and "Greenland is ours." The two groups shouted at each other, the tension threatening to boil over. Police officers formed a line between the opposing factions, their presence a stark reminder of how deeply the nation had been divided. Heroes amid the chaos. Despite the despair, stories of resilience and heroism emerged. In Nuuk, a group of local volunteers organized to provide aid to their community. Led by Arnie Olsen, they distributed food and supplies to families in need, ensuring no one went hungry during the crisis. In a small village near the Polish border, Marta Kowalski helped reunite a Ukrainian family that had been separated during their flight from Kharkiv. Tears streamed down the parents' faces as they embraced their children for the first time in weeks. "You've given us hope," the mother said, gripping Marta's hands tightly. And on the North Atlantic, acts of humanity shone through even amidst the tension. When an American naval helicopter experienced engine failure and crashed into icy waters, a nearby NATO frigate, the HMS Valor, diverted from its patrol to rescue the downed crew. The incident, though minor, served as a fleeting reminder of shared values and the capacity for compassion. The psychological toll, for those on the front lines, the psychological toll was immense. On board the USS Freedom, Admiral Jonathan Reed found himself grappling with the weight of his responsibilities. Late at night, he sat alone in his quarters, staring at a photograph of his wife and two daughters. "You've trained for this your entire life," he whispered to himself. "But why does it feel so wrong?" In the barracks of Fort Bragg, Private Amanda Hayes struggled to reconcile her doubts with her duty. She wrote a letter to her parents, her pen trembling with uncertainty. "Mom, Dad, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I want to believe in what we're fighting for, but I'm scared. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." A nation under strain. As the days turned into weeks, the human cost of the Greenland conflict became undeniable. Families were separated, livelihoods destroyed, and lives lost. The once proud alliances that had defined the post-World War II era now seemed fragile and distant, their promises of unity and peace overshadowed by ambition and discord. For the people caught in the middle, the question remained, how much longer could they endure? Chapter 9. The Cyber Battleground. While battles loomed in the icy waters of the North Atlantic and tensions flared in Eastern Europe, a quieter, more insidious war was unfolding in cyberspace. This was a war without borders, fought in the shadows by hackers, analysts, and artificial intelligence systems. It was a conflict as vital as any naval blockade or military skirmish, a struggle for control over the digital infrastructure that underpinned modern life. The first cyber strikes. The first salvos in the cyber war were subtle, almost imperceptible to the average citizen. In Washington, D.C., government servers experienced unexplained slowdowns, and communication networks occasionally dropped without warning. At first, these disruptions were dismissed as technical glitches, but cybersecurity experts knew better. "It's coordinated," said Marissa Blake, a senior analyst at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. She pointed at a digital map in the agency's command center, where red dots marked the locations of recent attacks. "These aren't random failures. Someone is probing our defenses." The culprits were not hard to identify. Russian cyber units, already infamous for their sophistication, had been working overtime to disrupt American systems. Simultaneously, Chinese hackers targeted NATO's logistics networks, sowing chaos in the alliance's efforts to coordinate troop and supply movements. In retaliation, American and NATO cyber teams launched their own offensives. Codenamed Operation Icebreaker, their mission was to infiltrate and disable Russian and Chinese systems critical to their military operations. The stakes were high. Control over information could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The impact on civilians. As the cyber war escalated, its effects spilled over into civilian life. In New York City, commuters found themselves stranded when the subway system suffered a massive outage. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority confirmed it had been the target of a ransomware attack, its servers locked by an unknown hacker group demanding payment in cryptocurrency. "It's chaos down here," one commuter said during a news broadcast, her frustration echoing through the packed subway platform. Why is the government letting this happen? In London, similar disruptions hit the financial sector. Traders at the London Stock Exchange watched in horror as their systems froze mid-session, halting transactions worth billions. The attack sent shockwaves through global markets, further deepening the economic turmoil. "It's like someone turned off the tap," said Daniel Price, a financial analyst. "One minute, everything's running smoothly. The next, we're dead in the water." Disinformation and mistrust. Beyond technical attacks, the cyber battleground became a theater for disinformation campaigns. Social media platforms were flooded with fake news, deepfake videos, and conspiracy theories designed to sow division and mistrust. In the United States, false narratives about the Greenland conflict spread like wildfire. Some posts claimed Greenlanders had welcomed American forces with open arms, while others insisted NATO was plotting to overthrow the U.S. government. The truth was lost in a sea of misinformation. In a small newsroom in Chicago, journalist David Carter worked tirelessly to debunk these falsehoods. Armed with little more than his laptop and determination, he fact-checked viral claims and published corrections. But his efforts often felt like a drop in the ocean. "They're playing on our fears," Carter said during a live interview. "If we don't start questioning what we see and hear, we're playing right into their hands." The unsung heroes amidst the chaos, a group of underground hackers emerged as unlikely heroes. Calling themselves Echo Rising, the collective operated anonymously, exposing the origins of cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. Their motives were unclear, but their actions had a profound impact. In one operation, Echo Rising intercepted and leaked documents revealing that a Russian cyber unit had orchestrated the subway ransomware attack in New York. The revelation led to widespread condemnation and prompted NATO to bolster its cyber defenses. In another instance, the group hacked into a Chinese server and uncovered evidence of their disinformation campaigns targeting European nations. The documents were shared with the media, forcing Beijing to deny involvement publicly. A critical turning point. As the cyber war raged on, the stakes reached a critical turning point. At NATO's Cyber Operations Center in Brussels, Director Helena Voss received an urgent report from her team. "We've detected a new malware strain," an analyst explained. "It's targeting critical infrastructure, power grids, water systems, even hospitals. If it spreads, the damage could be catastrophic." Voss didn't hesitate. "Launch Operation Firewall. Contain it before it spreads further." Operation Firewall was a coordinated effort involving NATO's brightest minds in cybersecurity. For hours, they worked tirelessly, isolating the malware and neutralizing its effects. The operation was a success, but it highlighted just how vulnerable modern societies had become. In Washington, Marissa Blake reflected on the cyber war's implications. "This isn't just about Greenland or NATO," she said. "It's about the world we've built. Everything we rely on, our power, our water, our communication, it's all connected, and that makes it a target." The psychological toll. For those on the front lines of the cyber war, the psychological toll was immense. At the NSA's Fort Meade headquarters, young analysts worked 12-hour shifts, their eyes glued to monitors filled with endless streams of code. The constant pressure to stay one step ahead of the enemy left many feeling drained and detached. "We're fighting ghosts," said one analyst, speaking on condition of anonymity. "We don't see the enemy, but we feel them everywhere. It's exhausting." The war's new front. As the chapter of the cyber battleground unfolded, It became clear that the war was no longer confined to physical territories. The digital realm had become as critical as the seas around Greenland or the skies over Eastern Europe. It was a new kind of war, one where the victors would not be determined by strength alone, but by ingenuity, resilience, and the ability to adapt. And as the conflict dragged on, the question loomed larger than ever. How much more could the world endure before the lines between ally and enemy blurred beyond recognition? Chapter 10. Trump's Last Stand. The Greenland conflict reached its most critical juncture as pressure mounted on President Trump from every direction. Inside the White House, the once confident administration was unraveling, its unity shattered by dissent and mistrust. Yet Trump, steadfast in his conviction, prepared for what he believed would be his defining moment in history, a bold stand to secure America's dominance, no matter the cost. A nation in turmoil, outside the White House, the streets of Washington, D.C., were a microcosm of the chaos gripping the nation. Protesters camped on Pennsylvania Avenue, their chants echoing late into the night. Banners reading "No blood for ICE" and "Impeach Trump Now" fluttered in the cold January wind. Inside, the Oval Office had become an isolated fortress. Trump spent most of his time alone, poring over maps and intelligence reports, convinced that victory was within his grasp. His closest allies, however, were growing increasingly uneasy. Stephen McCall, Trump's longest-serving advisor, stood by the fireplace, watching the president with a mix of concern and frustration. "Mr. President, the protests are growing, the polls are plummeting, even your supporters in Congress are starting to waver." Trump waved a dismissive hand. "Polls don't matter. Protests don't matter. What matters is strength. And when we win Greenland, the world will see that strength." McCall hesitated, then took a step closer. "With respect, sir, the world isn't seeing strength right now. They're seeing a nation divided, a military questioning its orders, and allies turning into enemies." Trump's eyes narrowed. "Then they're wrong, and so are you." The breaking point in the military. At the Pentagon, the military's growing unease reached a breaking point. General Robert Harding convened a secret meeting with his top commanders to discuss the escalating crisis. "We're being asked to do the unthinkable. Fight NATO," Harding began, his voice steady but grave. "This isn't what we signed up for. It's not what we swore an oath to defend." Admiral Karen Lynn leaned forward, her face lined with fatigue. "The rank and file are questioning everything. Morale is at rock bottom. If we push any further, we risk mutiny." Colonel David Harris, a rising star in the Army, spoke up. "The troops are loyal to the Constitution, not to any one man. If this continues, we'll have no choice but to defy the orders." Harding nodded, his expression heavy with the weight of their decisions. "Then we must prepare for the possibility of acting independently. We cannot allow this to spiral into a full-scale war with our allies." The assassination attempt. As tensions mounted, a shocking event brought the nation to the brink of collapse. During a rare public appearance at a rally in Texas, an armed man attempted to assassinate Trump. The Secret Service responded swiftly, subduing the assailant before he could fire a second shot. The president was unharmed, but the incident sent shockwaves across the country. The would-be assassin, a disillusioned veteran named Marcus Riley, was taken into custody. His manifesto, released to the media, revealed his motivation, a belief that Trump's actions were destroying the nation he had once sworn to protect. "I love this country," Riley wrote, "but I cannot stand by while it's torn apart by greed and lies." The assassination attempt only deepened the divide. Trump supporters rallied behind him, calling for harsher measures against dissent. His critics, meanwhile, pointed to the incident as evidence of the nation's unraveling. In a televised address from the Oval Office, Trump struck a defiant tone. "This was not just an attack on me, it was an attack on America. But let me be clear, we will not be intimidated, we will not back down." Fractures in the cabinet. Behind the scenes, Trump's cabinet was falling apart. Janice Porter, the chief of staff, called an emergency meeting with Vice President Malcolm Green and several key officials. The room was filled with tension as Porter laid out her concerns. "This administration is collapsing," she said bluntly. "The military is on the edge of rebellion, the public is in open revolt, and the president refuses to see reason." Green sighed, rubbing his temples. "What are you suggesting, Janice?" Porter took a deep breath. We need to invoke the 25th Amendment. He's unfit to lead, and every day we delay brings us closer to disaster. The room fell silent. Finally, Secretary of Defense Laura Kent spoke. If we do this, we're risking everything. The backlash from his base could tear the country apart. And if we don't, Porter countered, we're risking a war we can't win. The decision weighed heavily on them all, but the wheels were set in motion. Quiet conversations began among cabinet members, each gauging the other's willingness to act. The turning point. The turning point came during a high-stakes meeting in the Situation Room. Trump, flanked by his dwindling circle of loyalists, received an update from the North Atlantic Fleet. The skirmishes near Greenland were intensifying, with NATO forces holding their ground against American advances. Admiral Jonathan Reed, speaking via video link, delivered the grim news. Mr. President, our current strategy isn't sustainable. We're losing resources and personnel faster than we can replace them. Trump's face darkened. Then escalate. I don't care what it takes. Greenland will be ours. General Harding, who had grown increasingly vocal in his opposition, finally reached his breaking point. Mr. President, with all due respect, this isn't about Greenland anymore. It's about the survival of our nation. If we continue down this path, we risk losing everything. Trump's gaze locked onto Harding, his voice icy. Are you questioning my orders, General? Harding stood his ground. I'm questioning your judgment, sir. The room fell into a tense silence. For a moment, it seemed as though Trump might explode, but instead, he leaned back in his chair, a cold smile playing on his lips. Then maybe it's time for some new leadership in the military, he said. You're dismissed, General. Harding's departure marked a symbolic moment, the unraveling of the administration's authority. The cracks had become chasms, and the nation teetered on the edge of chaos. The last stand. As the conflict reached its climax, Trump prepared for his last stand. Surrounded by his most loyal supporters, he doubled down on his rhetoric, framing himself as a lone warrior fighting against a world that refused to understand his vision. But even as he spoke, the tides were turning. The military's refusal to escalate, combined with growing public unrest and cabinet dissent, set the stage for a dramatic confrontation that would determine the future of the nation. And as the world watched, holding its breath, the question remained, would America survive its own leader? Chapter 11. The Turning Point. The nation, gripped by chaos and uncertainty, hurtled toward a moment of reckoning. In Washington, protests reached a fever pitch, and whispers of rebellion grew louder in the halls of power. It was a moment that would define not only the Greenland conflict, but the very future of the United States. The assassination attempt's fallout. The assassination attempt on President Trump had left an indelible mark on the nation. While the president used the incident to galvanize his base, the attack further fractured an already divided populace. Supporters saw Trump as a martyr for American strength, while his detractors viewed the event as a symptom of the country's spiraling instability. In cities across the U.S., the streets were filled with both pro- and anti-Trump demonstrations. Clashes between the two sides grew more violent, with police often caught in the crossfire. In Seattle, a protest turned deadly when an armed confrontation erupted, leaving 2 dead and several injured. It's like the country's tearing itself apart, said a reporter covering the chaos. And no one knows how to stop it. The cabinet's decision. Inside the White House, Trump's cabinet reached its breaking point. Janice Porter, the chief of staff, convened a secret meeting with Vice President Malcolm Green and several cabinet members who had grown disillusioned with the president's leadership. We can't wait any longer, Porter said, her voice firm. The military is refusing to escalate, the protests are out of control, and the economy is collapsing. It's time to act. Green nodded, though his expression was one of reluctance. I've spoken with the Joint Chiefs. They're prepared to support us if we invoke the 25th Amendment. Secretary of Defense Laura Kent, who had been one of Trump's staunchest allies, finally spoke up. It's not just about removing him. It's about rebuilding trust in our institutions. If we do this, we have to be transparent. The people need to understand why. With a reluctant consensus reached, the cabinet members began drafting the necessary documents to invoke the 25th Amendment. It was a historic and unprecedented move, one that would undoubtedly reshape the nation's political landscape. the Greenland standoff. Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, the standoff between U.S. and NATO forces intensified. The icy waters around Greenland were crowded with warships, submarines, and aircraft, their crews operating under constant tension. Every sonar ping, every radar blip was a potential spark for conflict. On board the USS Freedom, Admiral Jonathan Reed received a direct order from the White House: escalate operations and force NATO to withdraw. Reed, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the president's leadership, hesitated. "Sir," his second-in-command, Captain Evelyn Park, said cautiously, "if we follow these orders, it could trigger an all-out war." Reed nodded, his face lined with exhaustion. "And if we don't, we're disobeying a direct order from the Commander-in-Chief." After a long pause, Reed made his decision. "Signal NATO command. Request an emergency dialogue. If we're going to end this, it won't be through war." The emergency dialogue in Brussels, NATO Secretary-General Lars Östberg received the unexpected request from the American fleet. Surprised but not unprepared, he immediately convened an emergency meeting with NATO leaders. "This may be our only chance to de-escalate," Östberg said. "If Admiral Reed is willing to talk, we need to seize the opportunity." The dialogue was arranged in secret, with representatives from both sides meeting aboard a neutral vessel in the waters near Iceland. The atmosphere was tense as Reed and Östberg faced each other across a conference table. "We're not here to concede," Reed began, his tone firm but measured. "But this conflict is spiraling out of control. Both sides stand to lose everything if we don't find a way forward." Östberg nodded. "Agreed. NATO's position is clear. Greenland is not for the taking, but we're willing to explore a diplomatic resolution." Over the course of several hours, the two sides worked toward a fragile understanding. The talks were difficult, punctuated by moments of heated argument and uneasy compromise. In the end, they reached an agreement to suspend hostilities and begin formal negotiations through diplomatic channels. The announcement back in Washington, the cabinet finalized its decision to invoke the 25th Amendment. Vice President Green stood in the Situation Room, flanked by Janice Porter and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "We're taking a monumental step," Green said, his voice steady but somber. "But it's the right step, for the nation, for the Constitution, and for the future." The announcement was made during a televised address. Green stood before the nation, his expression a mix of resolve and regret. "My fellow Americans," he began, "our nation is at a crossroads. Over the past months, we have faced unprecedented challenges and divisions. It is with a heavy heart that I announce the invocation of the 25th Amendment, as the President is no longer able to fulfill the duties of his office." The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Trump's supporters flooded the streets in protest, decrying the move as a coup. His detractors celebrated, viewing it as the first step toward healing the nation. The world reacts around the globe. The announcement sent shockwaves through political and military circles. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin watched the broadcast with a calculating smile. "The Americans have weakened themselves," he remarked to his advisors. "We will bide our time." In Beijing, President Xi Jinping convened his top officials to discuss the implications of the U.S. leadership change. "The West is fractured," he said. "We must solidify our position while they rebuild." A fragile peace. In the days that followed, the Greenland conflict began to de-escalate. NATO and U.S. forces pulled back from their positions, and the diplomatic talks initiated by Admiral Reed laid the groundwork for a tentative peace. In Nuuk, Greenland's residents breathed a sigh of relief as the military presence around their island diminished. Arne Olsen, the local leader who had worked tirelessly to support his community, addressed a gathering in the town square. "We have endured much," he said, "but we must now focus on rebuilding and moving forward. Our strength lies in our unity." The nation at a crossroads. As the dust began to settle, the United States faced the monumental task of healing from the divisions that had torn it apart. The removal of President Trump marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a chapter filled with challenges and the hope of reconciliation. And as the world watched, one question remained. Could America rise from the ashes of its greatest test, stronger and more united than before? Chapter 12. The Collapse of Giants. As the Greenland conflict de-escalated, The United States and NATO shifted focus from immediate hostilities to the daunting task of rebuilding fractured alliances and addressing the damage caused by months of tension and unrest. The ripple effects of the conflict reached far beyond Greenland, altering the global power balance and exposing vulnerabilities in the once mighty institutions that had defined the post-World War II era. America in crisis. The United States, reeling from the invocation of the 25th Amendment and the removal of President Trump, entered a period of political upheaval. Vice President Malcolm Green, now acting as president, faced an uphill battle to stabilize the nation. In his first address to Congress, Green struck a conciliatory tone. "Our nation has endured great trials," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "but the American spirit is resilient. Together we will rebuild trust, heal divisions, and chart a new course for our future." The task was monumental. Protests continued to rage in cities across the country, with Trump supporters refusing to accept his removal. Conspiracy theories flourished, fueled by fringe media outlets and online forums. The FBI launched investigations into armed militias that had threatened to take action against the government, leading to tense standoffs in several states. In the military, the fallout from the conflict was equally severe. General Robert Harding, who had openly opposed Trump's orders, was hailed as a hero by some and branded a traitor by others. The divide within the armed forces mirrored that of the nation, with factions forming around loyalty to the Constitution versus allegiance to the ousted president. NATO's fragile victory. For NATO, the resolution of the Greenland conflict was a victory in name only. The alliance had succeeded in defending Greenland and maintaining its unity, but the cost had been immense. The prolonged standoff drained resources and tested the limits of cooperation among member states. In Brussels, NATO Secretary General Lars Isberg addressed the North Atlantic Council. "We have emerged from this crisis intact," he said. "But let us not mistake survival for strength. This conflict has revealed cracks in our foundation that must be addressed." Some member nations, particularly those in Eastern Europe, criticized NATO for its initial hesitation to act decisively. Poland and the Baltic states demanded greater guarantees of protection against Russian aggression, citing the increased presence of Russian forces near their borders during the conflict. Russia's overreach in Moscow. President Vladimir Putin reveled in the chaos that had unfolded in the West, but his ambitions came at a cost. While the United States and NATO were distracted, Russia had moved swiftly to assert control over parts of Eastern Europe, deploying unmarked troops and spreading disinformation to sow confusion. However, the Kremlin's actions sparked resistance from the affected regions. In Ukraine, a grassroots movement of civilians and former soldiers organized to push back against Russian advances. Armed with weapons smuggled in from sympathetic NATO allies, they launched a series of guerrilla-style attacks on Russian forces. In Latvia and Lithuania, covert resistance networks worked to undermine Russian influence, sabotaging supply lines and exposing Moscow's propaganda campaigns. These efforts, while courageous, drew brutal reprisals from Russian forces, further inflaming tensions in the region. Putin, facing growing dissent at home due to the economic strain of his military campaigns, found himself increasingly isolated. The Russian economy, already weakened by sanctions, buckled under the weight of prolonged conflict. Protests erupted in Moscow and St. Petersburg, with demonstrators demanding an end to the Kremlin's foreign adventurism. China's calculated gains. While Russia stumbled, China played a longer, more strategic game. President Xi Jinping capitalized on the West's distraction to solidify China's dominance in the South China Sea and expand its influence over Pacific nations. In Manila, the Philippine government, under pressure from Beijing, signed an agreement granting China access to its ports and resources. Similar deals were struck with smaller Pacific island nations, effectively extending China's sphere of influence across the region. However, China's aggressive moves were not without consequences. Japan and South Korea, alarmed by Beijing's expansion, increased their military spending and strengthened ties with each other and with the United States. The Indo-Pacific became a new focal point of geopolitical tension, with the potential for conflict simmering just below the surface. The human cost. Amid the geopolitical maneuvering, the human cost of the Greenland Conflict and its aftermath remained profound. In Nuuk, Greenland's capital, residents worked to rebuild their disrupted lives. Fishermen returned to sea, navigating waters still patrolled by the remnants of NATO and U.S. fleets. Schools reopened, though the children carried the weight of the conflict in their quiet resilience. In Eastern Europe, refugee camps along the Polish and Romanian borders swelled with families displaced by Russian aggression. Aid workers struggled to provide food, shelter, and medical care to those who had lost everything. Marta Kowalski, a volunteer at one such camp, described the situation as dire but hopeful. "These people have endured unimaginable hardship," she said, "but they haven't lost their humanity. They help each other, even when they have nothing." In the United States, families of soldiers deployed to Greenland and the North Atlantic mourned the lives lost in the conflict. Memorials were held in towns and cities across the country, honoring the sacrifices made by those who had fought and died. A new world order. As the dust settled, the world began to take stock of the new geopolitical landscape. The Greenland conflict marked the end of an era, signaling the collapse of the unipolar world dominated by the United States. In its place emerged a more fragmented, multipolar order, with power distributed among competing nations and alliances. In Brussels, NATO leaders convened a summit to discuss the future of the alliance. Proposals included the creation of a rapid response force to address emerging threats and the establishment of a new cyber defense initiative to counteract the vulnerabilities exposed during the conflict. In Washington, Acting President Green announced a series of reforms aimed at restoring trust in government institutions. These included measures to improve transparency, strengthen checks and balances, and address the deep divisions within American society. The lessons learned. The Greenland conflict and its aftermath served as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the dangers of unchecked ambition. It exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful nations and highlighted the resilience of those who dared to stand against tyranny. In classrooms around the world, students studied the events as a cautionary tale. They learned not just about the battles and treaties, but about the human stories of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring struggle for justice. For the people of Greenland, the conflict became a part of their history, a testament to their strength and determination. And for the world, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with challenges, but also with the promise of a more balanced and cooperative future. Chapter 13. The New World Order. In the wake of the Greenland conflict, the global balance of power shifted irrevocably. The nations of the world, reeling from months of military tension, economic instability, and political upheaval, were left to pick up the pieces and forge a path forward. As new alliances emerged and old ones faltered, the world entered an era of uncertainty, defined by cautious diplomacy and a recognition of the high costs of conflict. The United States rebuilds in Washington. Acting President Malcolm Green focused on stabilizing a fractured nation. His first acts in office were aimed at restoring public trust in government institutions. He established a bipartisan commission to investigate the decisions that led to the Greenland conflict and introduced sweeping reforms designed to prevent such crises in the future. "We must learn from our mistakes," Green said in a televised address. "The cost of ambition unchecked is a cost too great to bear. Together, we will rebuild not just our nation, but the values that make us strong." The reforms included stricter limits on executive power, increased transparency in military operations, and measures to protect democratic processes from manipulation. Green also worked to address the deep divisions within American society, launching initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding between opposing factions. Despite these efforts, the scars of the conflict remained. The economy, still reeling from the disruptions caused by the war, faced a long road to recovery. Families of soldiers who had served in the conflict struggled with grief and anger, while communities across the country grappled with the lingering polarization that had fueled the crisis. NATO's transformation. For NATO, the Greenland conflict served as both a wake-up call and a turning point. The alliance emerged from the crisis intact, but fundamentally changed. Secretary General Lars Östberg called for a comprehensive review of NATO's mission and structure, emphasizing the need for adaptability in a rapidly changing world. "We cannot afford complacency," Ostberg said at a summit in Brussels. "The challenges we face are not just military, but economic, cyber, and societal. NATO must evolve to meet these challenges head-on." The alliance introduced several key reforms, including the establishment of a rapid response force capable of addressing emerging threats, a robust cyber defense initiative to counteract vulnerabilities exposed during the conflict, and a renewed focus on strengthening partnerships with non-member states. Eastern European nations, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, pushed for greater investment in regional defense, citing the ongoing threat posed by Russian aggression. These efforts led to the creation of the Eastern Defense Initiative, a joint task force aimed at bolstering security along NATO's eastern flank. Russia's reckoning. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin faced the consequences of his overreach. While the distraction of the Greenland conflict had allowed Russia to make gains in Eastern Europe, these gains came at a steep cost. The prolonged military campaigns drained the country's resources and strained its economy, which was already weakened by international sanctions. Protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators demanding an end to foreign adventurism and greater accountability from the Kremlin. In St. Petersburg, a young activist named Katya Ivanova became the face of the opposition, delivering impassioned speeches that resonated with a growing number of disillusioned citizens. "We are not pawns in a game of power," Ivanova declared at a rally. "We are the people of Russia, and we deserve a future built on hope, not conquest." Under mounting pressure, Putin was forced to scale back his military ambitions and focus on domestic issues. His hold on power, while still strong, began to show signs of weakening as cracks appeared in the Kremlin's carefully constructed facade. China's strategic expansion. While Russia stumbled, China emerged from the Greenland conflict in a position of relative strength. President Xi Jinping's strategy of calculated expansion in the Pacific paid off, as Beijing solidified its control over the South China Sea and strengthened ties with key regional allies. However, China's aggressive tactics also provoked backlash. Japan, South Korea, and Australia formed a trilateral security pact, bolstered by support from the United States, to counterbalance Beijing's influence. The Indo-Pacific region became a new focal point of global competition, with both sides vying for strategic advantage. In Beijing, Xi sought to portray China as a stabilizing force in a chaotic world. At an international summit, he emphasized the importance of cooperation and economic development, positioning China as a leader in addressing global challenges. "The world must move beyond conflict," Xi said. "China stands ready to lead the way toward a more harmonious future." Greenland's resilience. For the people of Greenland, the conflict became a defining chapter in their history. In Nuuk, local leader Arne Olsen worked tirelessly to rebuild his community, fostering a spirit of resilience and unity. "We have endured much," Olsen said in a speech to the town, "but we are strong and we will continue to stand together, no matter what challenges come our way." Greenland's strategic importance ensured that it remained a key player in global affairs. While the island maintained its ties to Denmark, its leadership pushed for greater autonomy and a stronger voice on the international stage. A fragile peace. The resolution of the Greenland conflict marked the beginning of a new era, but the peace that followed was fragile. The world remained deeply divided, with old alliances reshaped and new rivalries emerging. The lessons of the conflict served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of diplomacy. In classrooms around the globe, students studied the events of the Greenland conflict as a cautionary tale. They learned not just about the geopolitical strategies and military maneuvers, but also about the human stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. For the world, the Greenland conflict was both a warning and an opportunity, a chance to reflect on the costs of conflict and the potential for cooperation. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could endure, and that the future, while uncertain, remained unwritten. Chapter 14, Reflections of a Broken Future. Years passed, but the echoes of the Greenland conflict remained vivid in the memories of those who lived through it. The world, though outwardly stable, carried scars that were slow to heal. Across continents, governments, citizens, and historians alike reflected on the profound lessons of a crisis that had brought the global order to the brink of collapse. The aftermath in the United States. In Washington, the reforms initiated under acting President Malcolm Greene began to take root. Public trust in government institutions showed signs of recovery, but the divisions exposed during the conflict proved more difficult to mend. Communities that had turned against each other during the height of the crisis struggled to reconcile, with old wounds reopened by political rhetoric and misinformation. The military faced its own reckoning. General Robert Harding, who had stood against unconstitutional orders, became a symbol of integrity and resilience. His memoir, Against the Tide: Leadership in Crisis, became a bestseller and was widely regarded as a blueprint for ethical decision-making in times of national strife. Yet the challenges persisted. Veterans of the Greenland standoff returned to a nation still grappling with its identity. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress, their experiences compounded by the sense that the conflict they had fought in was misunderstood or dismissed by those at home. Greenland's quiet strength. In Nuuk, life slowly returned to normal, though the memories of war were not easily forgotten. Arne Olsen continued to lead his community with quiet determination, fostering a spirit of resilience and pride among the people of Greenland. The island's strategic importance remained a point of contention among global powers, but its leaders worked to assert their autonomy and protect their unique culture. Greenlanders took pride in their ability to endure, drawing strength from their shared history and connection to the land. "We have shown the world who we are," Olsen said during a commemoration of the conflict. Greenland is not just a place on a map. It is a people, a history, and a future worth fighting for. A shifting world order. Globally, the Greenland conflict marked the beginning of a new and more fragmented geopolitical landscape. The United States, though still a major power, no longer held the unchallenged dominance it once did. Instead, power was distributed among regional blocs, each vying for influence in an increasingly multipolar world. NATO, having weathered the storm, emerged as a more adaptable alliance, with a renewed focus on cybersecurity, regional defense, and rapid response. The Eastern Defense Initiative became a cornerstone of its strategy, ensuring that the alliance remained prepared for future challenges. In Asia, the balance of power continued to shift. The rivalry between China and the U.S.-led Pacific Coalition defined much of the region's politics, with both sides engaging in a delicate dance of competition and cooperation. The South China Sea, once a flashpoint, became a heavily militarized zone, its waters patrolled by fleets from multiple nations. The role of technology. The cyber battleground that had played such a critical role in the conflict continued to evolve. Governments invested heavily in cybersecurity, recognizing the vulnerabilities exposed during the crisis. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing became central to national defense strategies, with countries racing to gain an edge in the digital arms race. However, the proliferation of technology also sparked ethical debates. The use of AI in warfare, surveillance, and disinformation campaigns raised questions about the limits of human control and the potential consequences of technological overreach. Reflections and memorials. Around the world, the Greenland conflict became a subject of intense study and reflection. Universities hosted debates on the ethical and strategic failures that had led to the crisis, while think tanks published reports on the lessons learned. In Nuuk, a memorial was erected to honor those who had suffered during the conflict. The monument, a towering sculpture of intertwined ice and steel, symbolized the resilience of Greenland's people and their commitment to peace. Visitors from around the world came to pay their respects, drawn by the story of a small nation that had stood firm in the face of global turmoil. The human legacy. For those who lived through the conflict, the memories were both a burden and a source of strength. Families who had lost loved ones found solace in their communities, while veterans of the standoff worked to rebuild their lives and share their stories. In Eastern Europe, resistance movements that had risen against Russian aggression became symbols of hope and determination. Activists like Katya Ivanova, who had led protests in Moscow, continued to advocate for democracy and human rights, inspiring a new generation of leaders. The lessons of history. As the years turned into decades, the Greenland conflict was remembered not just as a geopolitical crisis, but as a defining moment for humanity. It was a story of ambition and hubris, of resilience and sacrifice, and of the enduring struggle to find common ground in a divided world. In classrooms across the globe, students studied the conflict as a cautionary tale. They learned about the decisions that had led to the brink of war and the efforts that had brought the world back from the edge. But they also learned about the people, the leaders, soldiers, and civilians, whose lives had been forever changed by the events. For the world, the Greenland conflict was a reminder of both its fragility and its strength. It was a call to action, a challenge to build a future that valued cooperation over conflict and understanding over division. And though the future remained uncertain, one truth endured: the lessons of the past could guide the way forward, if only humanity was willing to learn.